Thank you for joining us today for Armchair Historians. I'm your host, Anne-Marie Cannon. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. You can also find us at armchairhistorians.com. Also, won't you consider becoming a patron of the show? In an effort to keep Armchair Historians commercial-free, I have decided to work with Patreon. Now, if you mosey on over to www.patreon.com/armchairhistorians, that's historians with an S, you can find out more about supporting the show and about exclusive patron content that you will have access to. You can chip in anywhere from $1 to $15 a month or just make a one-time donation. You will be helping me to keep the lights on. And if you can't make a donation, that's totally cool. I just hope you will continue to listen to our free podcasts. Today we continue talking to Manuel, host of Random History of Belgium, a podcast that looks at events, companies, people, and the culture of Belgium. Through his podcast, Manuel informs, educates, and entertains his listeners by explaining random parts of history, ranging from playing cards, the Belgian royal family, to food and World War II, and much, much more. Today we pick up where we left off last week in the midst of a heated discussion about World War I and World War II in Belgium. The psyche of not just my mother, who was not alive during World War I, but all the people that were alive during World War I, and oh my God, here they come again. And what that did to them and why so many people clogged up the streets, and the Germans were able to use that as a kind of a weapon against the what we would call the Allied forces.
Yeah, but it's fascinating because what you say, the roads were at that moment blocked because so many people all started to flee at the same time. And that was partly because what they remembered, or their parents remembered, about World War I and what happened there. And the fear of the Germans was also known on the other side. They knew, like, okay, we have to treat them more humanly this time, because otherwise everyone will start fighting us, even normal citizens who would stir up stuff. And they explicitly did, not that they were kind, but it was not on the level of World War I when they invaded Belgium, specifically for that reason.
Yeah, I interviewed a guy named Jeff Lipkes. He wrote a book called Rehearsals Belgium in August 1914. No, the Germans in Belgium, August 1914. And he wrote a book, and it really was a culmination of people's experiences. And my aunt, Adele, my great aunt, her account was in that book, and that's how I found him. And so he wrote this book about, he said he wanted to set the record straight, because there's still people today who believe that what happened wasn't as bad as they said it was. They said it was propaganda, the rape of Belgium was all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so he was a professor, and he came across all this material, and he wrote this book, and I recommend it. But he was a guest on my show. I think he was my last guest. And he talks about that. He talks about the military, the German military was told to watch what you do and to not repeat what happened in World War I. But having said that, the psychological impact, I think, was already, fostered inside of people. And, we do talk about, there is a lot of gray areas. There is a story in the documentary we talk about my mom in La Roche-sur-Yon in France, because that's where her family ends up. And it ends up being, it's a German military town during the war. And there is a really touching story about a German soldier. So I realize that there is two sides, like you say, and I hope to bring
Mhm.
out some of that, ambiguity as far as my mom always said that there was a difference between the SS and
Yeah,
a regular German soldier, and
absolutely.
she, at a young age, learned that.
Yeah, the level of fanaticism was, of course, much different. We also see that I have one episode about one of the concentration camps in Brendonk in Belgium, where the SS actually had an internment camp there to work people to death. And
I didn't know that.
so one of the, well, not, it's not a contest, of course, it's not, but it's one of the places that's being perceived as the worst by the people who were actually imprisoned there. Because of the fanatics that ran the place. What's often forgotten is that this fanaticism also is a pendulum and it swings back and forth. And when, for example, in that case, when that place was liberated, the resistance, okay, let's call them the resistance, took over and they did actually the same, but with people who collaborated with the
Hmm.
Germans in
Yeah.
the same place.
Hmm.
So it's a swinging pendulum, and you
It
cannot
is.
look away like, okay, that first part fits whatever narrative you want to tell. That second part, we're going to ignore because no, it happens, and
This story
we
is
tell the
not
story.
about Germans being bad. It's a human
Mhm.
story. It's what we're
Absolutely,
capable of. I look at the United States and, just some of the things I've seen in the
absolutely.
newspaper the past few days. A young man in Georgia who was, I don't know if you heard the story, a father and son went out. They were basically hunting for sport and they shot a black man who was jogging in his neighborhood. I
Oh.
believe that our administration has fostered this and emboldened people to act out on these, things that are based in fear and hate and racism. And so I see what I see and why I feel this story is so important to tell is
Mhm.
because a lot of that stuff is happening again. And it's happening in the United States. I can tell you that for sure. And it's so shocking to me. It's so shocking to me, but I keep remembering it's not about a group of people, it's about our humanness and what we're capable
Mhm.
of. And so,
I totally agree there. I totally agree. That's also the nice thing about diving into history, especially for Belgium. Everything has a few sides here. For example, we have the narrative of the north of Belgium, Flanders, who predominantly speaks Dutch, and then the French in the south, French speaking. And it's funny to see how this is played out sometimes, and they pitch people against each other,
mhm.
and it's something that repeats itself over and over again. And I sometimes find it very funny to dive into that if it's really from a while ago, and to see the similarities to something that's going
Yeah,
on right now. And but I don't explicitly tell this because I don't want to, like, oh, look at that, it's just like what happens now. If you do that all the time, it's a bit yeah, strange. But people hear it and they realize like what's going on, I think.
yeah.
History is fascinating that way. I never was into history like this. By doing the podcast, I learned how interesting it is to dive into that and to examine some things that happened. That's why I do this, because one thing I really want to tell is, you say armchair historians. I think that's very valuable, because the academic world and people who have this as their job and are historians and write books about it and so on, they, in my opinion, shield themselves. And I asked about 13 people in Belgium who are historians with degrees in history and so on, even a few well-known people, and they even don't want to respond. They want nothing to do with an amateur who has some stupid podcast.
Well, the thing that I
And
find about
it's strange.
academics, and I agree with you, the thing I find out find about academics and quote unquote historians, although I have interviewed historians,
Hmm.
there's this sense of like ownership of history that I see in some
Absolutely.
people. And it's, I am coming from a different place than that. I'm coming from that we all own the history. What does this narrative
Hmm.
mean to, another human being? And that's the jumping off point for armchair historians. I want to be as accurate as possible, but
Hmm.
it's really about what a narrative means to somebody and that passion that goes along with it. And nobody owns history. Nobody owns it. There's the facts. He walked down the street on, May 15th and the sun was shining. That's a fact. But then there's a lot of other layers to that. And it's his experience of walking down the street on a sunny day. So
Hmm.
history is there's a fabric and it's woven by many different things, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So and I love history. I've always loved history, but I've always felt on the outside
Hmm.
of this
Agree.
idea of academia and, history as a study. But what I've realized in the past few years is that no, history belongs to all of us.
The problem is they want to own something there, and I can understand if I examine something and I really dive into a certain subject and I discover whatever. I discover something like that politician did this and that and so on, and I'm the first one to discover that, and I write it in a blog or in a book or I make a podcast out of it, but it's a fact. Everybody can check it. It's a fact. Then everybody owns it. I can be mentioned as the guy putting that together. That's fine. And some people make a living of that by making books and saying, okay, I discovered this and that. I totally respect that. And I will always credit them like, okay, this book is great because he brings us a story about so and so and so. That's okay. But don't say that I cannot, let's say, ask a question. A nice difference was there's a technical guy I called at the moment at a certain point, and that's a totally different subject. And he works at the University of Leuven, and he's a specialist in encryption, a Belgian professor. He immediately offered to help out with the episodes. He even edited my texts to make them more accurate. He pointed out some mistake I made in something really deep technically, and I am technically myself. I worked with that stuff, and he even corrected me because he is the professor. He knows better than me how that stuff works. That's great. And I put him, I really say, like, okay, I, I will mention his name and I will tell on the podcast how great he was to work together. Do the same with someone who investigated some historical fact in Belgium and you hardly get any response. That's
Hmm.
my experience.
Mm.
There will be exceptions, of course. It's sometimes ridiculous. Like there was one guy who wrote a book about the Buck Riders, some mythical gang that lived in the Middle Ages or whatever. I forgot about the details. I contacted these guys, and the first thing he said, like, I will not help you with a podcast, but please buy my book.
Yeah.
And I answered him, like, I have the questions because I already read the book. And, but okay, whatever, man. And I did not mention his website. I did not mention his book. I did the episode with information I got from all other places. It's sometimes so closed down, and I think information belongs to not the people, but to us all. Let's
Mhm.
say if I want to look at a newspaper from the 50s on a microchip, I should do that. I pay taxes. They keep that library open with that money, and I have the right to look into that. If someone else, if my neighbor wants to do the same podcast, he can visit that library as well and have the same information. And it's sometimes too closed down, I think. But okay, I find ways around it. I
Yeah.
find my sources myself. And well, sometimes I see it picked up because if you make a podcast about something that they say, you remind us of something, then like 3 weeks afterwards, I see an article about that in some Belgian newspaper. And it's not a coincidence. If that happens once, maybe it's a guy who comes across the same idea as me. If that happens like 6 times in a row, it's not a coincidence.
Right. So this is another question I have for you. Who are your listeners?
A few Belgian people who just don't mind that I do this show in English. Well, not perfect English, as you can hear, but it's understandable.
No, your
But
English is good. Yeah.
mostly people all over the world, and it's maybe a cliche, but I have listeners from Chile, South Africa, Sweden, many people from the Wisconsin area because there are people from with Belgian ancestry there.
Interesting.
And well, I got sometimes I got mails like what's really cool is people mailing me like after the episodes about the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I made a whole series of episodes about what Belgians did there and so on. And a listener mailed me like, my father worked on that railroad you mentioned. And it's like, oh, that's cool. And then you can mail back and
Yeah.
forth about that. It touches people and they listen to so it's from all over the world, literally. I have people from Italy, the Netherlands, name it.
So how do you interact with your fans? How do they reach you and how do you interact with them?
Mostly by email and a bit Twitter, but Twitter is a bit of, well, kind of different. Hardly anyone will say, "Hey, I listened to your show on Twitter." That's a minority. It's mostly other podcasters who
I'm
start to
trying to crack
retweeting.
that nut, Twitter. I just
It's
can't. I mean,
yeah,
but having said
but
that, I don't have a lot of followers, but I have made some really good connections through Twitter.
that's
You're
really
one of
the
them.
key. Yeah, that's the key. You can make good connections there. You can talk to people who have the same interest. And so for me, Twitter is great as a podcaster, although sometimes there are these people who are there to promote themselves a bit too much. And I try to stay away from that because I'm totally not, I don't do marketing, for example. I will not do any
Oh,
marketing
that
at
was my
all.
other question. See, you don't do marketing.
No, nothing. It's if some listener tells another listener to listen to my show, that's my marketing.
Yeah, I spend a
It's
lot of time trying to market my show.
it's
Maybe, well,
it's no
that's what I
use.
do though. That's
So
part of my freelance business is I do
okay,
marketing.
yeah.
So,
I'm
but
I'm
you
really
know,
bad at that. I cannot do it.
but you've built up. It's been an organic build, I think, for your
Yeah,
audience,
absolutely.
and people have found you over
The
time.
first month I had like 20 downloads in total, which was
Really?
laughable. And then I thought like, okay, this is a nice experiment. I will not do any marketing and see how this grows. And that's organic growth, like
How
in
long have you been
series.
doing it?
5 years now.
Oh, okay. How long did it take for you to get to where you felt like, oh, this has an audience?
Yeah, about episode 25 to 30, it all of a sudden got a real boost. And that was also to do, I bought a new microphone because the first one I had no microphone. I just improvised and I used the thing in my laptop, the default microphone, which was horrible. But okay, I took it serious and I bought a decent, well, actually good microphone. And from that moment onwards, I saw it going a bit better. And it also has a lot to do with the subject I pick. So, for example, when I did an episode about Belgian beer, I literally saw 10 times the downloads than when I talked about Congo, for example.
That's
So
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, that
anytime
makes
if it's
sense.
Belgian and it's about beer or chocolates or something else to eat, it's great. They want to know,
Yeah.
but that audience sticks. So they also listen to the other stuff. And then I get emails sometimes from people like, "Hey, do something about this subject or that subject," and that's great. You can talk to people like that. And one thing I want to say because I have to go in 5 minutes,
Okay.
but the what I want to say is people keep repeating and mailing me about why don't you do an episode about that or that sports guy? Because we have like Eddie Merckx, the most famous bicycle runner. I'm not just interested in sport myself, so I have to really dive into that because if you make a mistake there, not knowing anything about the subject, I don't know how many world championships that guy has won by heart, of course. I really
Yeah.
have to dive into that. So that's a bit of a disadvantage of my podcast. If you want to have sports history, nah, you're not gonna find that much I did it twice, I think, but it's not my thing.
Yeah, it's not your bag. I got it. I get it. Is there anything else that you want to include? And, maybe we could schedule when you're not busy to do another half hour or so. Because
Hmm.
I think I'd like to plug this into both podcasts, like I said, Last Train Leaving
Great.
Belgium, as well as Armchair Historians. And, one of the things I would love to pick your brain about is about World War II and the resistance, because you do
Okay.
seem to know a lot about that. But is there anything else that you wanted to add at this point in time?
History is important, and it's important that independent people make podcasts and that people support that because if you have to pick information and learn history from your everyday media or an article in any newspaper, then it's really bad. It's dismal. It's totally, well, excuse me for to say this, but it's rotten. They pick what they can use in their narrative. They change it a bit, and then that's your history. So I want to really stress that. I think the podcast movement, especially for history, is great. You can learn about almost any country, be it Russia or Germany or the US or whatever, and dive into that and learn about people who are passionate about that, who read the books, who watch documentaries, who do research themselves. And that's more important than watching whatever channel and yeah, getting their narrative.
Yeah, I think what I keep hearing from you is that you have to look at all the sources. You have to, I mean, maybe not all of them, but
Yeah, as
look at
many as
different
possible.
sources,
Yeah.
different points of view. My boyfriend is really big on that. He reads the conservative media, he reads the liberal media. I don't know how he does that, but he does. I learned from
Hmm.
him that way. But it's important to him. And I've learned a lot from watching him do that, because it's easy to spin a narrative based on how
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
feel
Yeah.
and what my point of view is. That's interesting.
That's sometimes difficult because for example, the episode I'm doing right now about that White March and the big demonstration there, I have really big opinions and a lot to say about that personally, but I really have to keep my guard up to not do that because it's not an opinion show. It's
Right. And you're
yeah,
letting people make their own decision about it based on the information.
yeah.
And I think that's more
Sometimes I let it
valuable.
shine through a bit, of course. In some episodes, for example, I laugh with something because it's so ridiculous, and then everybody can make up their mind and guess what I'm really thinking about that. And that's not bad, but I'm not telling anyone like, oh, look how stupid these guys were.
Yeah.
No, because they're not stupid. They're just people in history who did something for whatever reason, and they are surrounded by other people who let them do that
Yeah.
for
Interesting.
also any reason. So it's not that certainly for Belgium it's sometimes really walking on eggshells, like not trying to push it one way or another. I really don't
Trying
want
not
to have
to.
the label like you are pro Flanders or you are against the French speaking or whatever. It's I honestly don't care about that in the history point of view.
Right.
I just want to tell what happened.
So you were born in Belgium, you're
Yeah.
Belgian,
Yeah.
and will you speak English? You probably speak French and Dutch. Is it Dutch?
Mhm.
No,
Yeah.
Flemish. No, what is it?
Flemish or
I'm so
Dutch?
bad.
Doesn't
Obviously.
matter for me.
What is it?
No, officially it's the Belgian version of Dutch.
Okay.
But well, where I live, they all say Flemish or Vlaams. So my mother tongue is Dutch and the Belgian variety, and I speak a bit French, but actually I'm really horrible at it because the schooling system wasn't ideal for me, let's say. So I can speak French a bit. I worked at some companies where French was the main language, so yeah, I can do something with that. I prefer English.
I loved Belgium. People were so nice. And
Mhm,
when they found out that I spoke English, they would speak English to me. My mother's French was really bad because she had lived in the United States for so long.
mhm.
And so I couldn't always rely on her. Plus, she was getting sick and she was towards the end of her life. But I loved Belgium. I loved the kindness and, that people were willing to help me. And, I loved everything about Belgium. Unfortunately, my mother never declared her citizenship at a certain point. She was living in the United States, and it was after the war, and she had to make a decision as to whether she was going to be French or Belgian, and she just didn't do it. And she just
Okay.
became American,
Yeah.
which I wish she would have declared one because I would have been able to become one of those, especially Belgium. I would love to be Belgian citizen.
Yeah, of course, I think Belgium is great as well, but it's hard to do a podcast about a country you really don't like. No, I
Yeah.
really think Belgium is great. The food, the people, everything, and also we have also a sense of humor about ourselves. We don't take ourselves too seriously most of the time. There are exceptions, and you can even laugh a bit with them. But it's a special country with a special history, and I really wanted to do this podcast also to emphasize that, to say like, hey, people, realize you live in a very special country. Even our election and our 50,000 governments we have, it's all there for a reason, and it's all there because we are that kind of special country. And yeah, there are disadvantages of that as well, but okay.
I never really appreciated my Belgian ancestry or heritage until probably the last 10 years. And the more I learn about it, there's so much diversity. It's like it is a melting pot of, the three countries that surround it, right? Is it three countries?
Well,
Yeah.
four if you count Great Britain.
Oh,
So you have France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Germany, and then the fifth one.
thank you
All
for
right.
joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Anne-Marie,
Okay.
good
Anne
evening.
Marie. Yeah.
Anne-Marie, thank me.
Yes.
Thank you.
So there you have it, Manuel, host of Random History of Belgium. Be sure to check out his podcast. I'll leave a link in the episode notes. Just a reminder, you can keep up to date on the latest Armchair Historians information on social media. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Also, won't you consider becoming a patron of the show? There's a link in our episode notes for Patreon where you can get more information. Thanks and have a great week.